Welcome to Showcasing Learning, Creating Digital Portfolios. This is one of our Summer Blitz sessions from Wayne Risa, and we're so glad that you can join us today. As with all of our sessions, we're focusing on those literacy essentials and how they might look regardless of what September might hold for us. Right now, we know that we have very little that we know, in that we may be remote or we may be face-to-face. But regardless of what school might look like, we know that focusing on those essential practices will help our students move forward in all areas. I am joined today by Heather Rotterman, Assessment and Instruction Consultant, and Rich Bacalor, Science Consultant. Rich will be manning our back channel, so any questions that you might have, please go ahead and put those in the chat and he'll make sure that he gets those answered. And I'm Michelle Wagner. I'm a literacy consultant here at Wayne Risa. For your convenience, we have a reflection guide for you. This is just a quick tool that you can use if you so choose to take notes on today's session. Rich will go ahead and put a link into the chat for you if you're interested in downloading that and using it for yourself. Just a few logistical things. We have the chat button that you can use to chat with one another. If you select panelists only the three of us, Rich, Heather, and myself, will be able to see your comments. But if you select all attendees, everyone in the session will be able to see what you have to say, and that's a great way to connect with one another and to share ideas between yourselves. We also have the question and answer for questions and comments that you might have that you maybe don't want connected to your name or you want us to lift privately. We can do that through the Q&A button. And then if you'd like to say something during our session, during our time together, go ahead and use that raise hand function. With that, I'll throw it over to Heather.
Thanks, Michelle. So as we begin today, we'd like to reference the essential instructional practices in literacy, as they are really the minimum standard of care that we want to provide for every child in every classroom every day. And we're really focusing in on Essential 9 today, because assessment really informs everything that we do in a classroom. So Rich is going to go ahead and throw a copy of the PDF of the essentials into the chat for your reference. And so as we begin, we want to take the time to think about today that our e-portfolios are not only a product that a student will produce, but they're also a process. And we begin by thinking about the whole child. Each classroom is really like a library where each student has their own unique story to tell. And portfolios could be a really powerful catalyst for students to capture and communicate the depth of their learning. Sometimes the responsibility of collecting and interpreting and sharing that story of our students is done by the teacher. We often overlook a powerful learning opportunity when the subject of that story is the creator of the portfolio, and the curator of that portfolio is the students themselves. Collecting and organizing and taking time to reflect on their own work builds students' understanding of themselves as learners, and it really nurtures a sense of accomplishment and helps to build that self-efficacy and learner agency that we want our students to have. We want our students to be reflective learners, and we hope that we can do so by utilizing portfolios so that they can cultivate their own internal feedback loop. They can learn to set their own goals. They can also notice new competencies and open themselves to challenges that are all habits that we want to instill in our students. So this is a really nice quote that comes from the Classroom Assessment for Student Learning book by Stiggins and the Chapuis. And it's really about how do we display evidence more than a collection of grades to provide a full story of student achievement and the journey towards competence, right? So portfolios can tell lots of stories, but the key to effective and efficient portfolios lies in knowing which story we want to tell, which includes maximizing the student's role. And that's why it comes back to having portfolios be student-centered around the whole child, because our children are more than just a grade. They have a really robust story narrative that they need to tell. Okay, Michelle, you're going to have to play the video, but as you watch this video, consider what happens when we quantify a student by a test score, a single test score or a single grade. So consider that as we watch this basketball player. So as you can see, this basketball player really messed that up. He completely biffed that shot. I don't play basketball, so my example would have been a soccer example, but this was a really good one to highlight what happens when we define our students and professional athletes by a single action on a single given day. This one shot, though he missed and missed really badly, does not sum up what this player knows and is able to do. The rest of the game, other games, previous games that he's played in, and how he is off the court, his integrity, really creates the narrative of this person's story. And it shows who he is and what he's able to do, right? So imagine if we were all defined by this one shot or one test score. Does that one score, or in this case, the game, really define us as learners? Does it tell our whole story? It doesn't. So we can use portfolios to really capture the whole story of a student.
So with that, it's very important to always ask yourself, what is your why? What is it that we're trying to accomplish, and why are we trying to accomplish this? As a literacy teacher, I'm constantly focused on stories, both the stories that I want my students to experience and the stories that I want them to tell. A portfolio is simply an intentional collection of artifacts that tell a predetermined story. All we want to do is give students a way to capture the story of their learning. So with that, I like to focus on the fact that it's 2020. And no one, at least not anyone I know, could have anticipated the story that we would have to tell this year. Yet there's no doubt that anyone who's living right now has a unique and a little bit strange story to tell about the last year that we've spent. And so we want to give students the opportunity to really embrace and lean into the uncertainty that is our current reality and just focus on the story that they have. So when I think about what might go into an e-portfolio, I think about those artifacts that'll show the learning process, what it looks like when learning actually happens. So those little pieces of the actual learning as it's happening might not be a polished, beautiful thing. It might be a picture of a student in the middle of a complex project, or it might be a rough draft. All of those pieces are okay because they show the learning process, and they can be something that we include in our e-portfolios. You can also use an e-portfolio to showcase best work. Traditionally, this is what I think of as being part of my portfolio, those things that I'm most proud of, that I did the best on, those gold star moments in my learning that really showcase what I can do. So I think of this as one of those capstone projects that I might put into a portfolio just to share with others, so that showcase of my best work. You can also use your e-portfolio as a way to document and share assessment information, to hold students accountable for certain pieces that they must complete before the year is over in order to show mastery of a certain content area. Specific types of e-portfolios, though, are those ones that share the learning process, that showcase our best work, and that share opportunities for assessment and accountability. There's no right or wrong choice here when you're thinking about what you might want to include, and it's very possible that your selection will include a little bit of all of these. What matters most of all, though, is that we constantly think back to what is our reason for having students collect this information? What is it that we want them to collect? And once we know that, once we know our purpose, our reason for compiling this information, then it's important that we focus on growing that collection of high quality work. Really thinking about what is it at the end of the marking period or the end of the trimester or the end of the school year that we want to be included in this portfolio, and how are we going to ensure that we have access to those pieces. So when I think of those portfolio worthy tasks, I think of things that require effort. Whether the end product was perfection or not is unimportant. Did a student put a lot of time into something? That might make it portfolio worthy. It also allows for some level of student voice and choice. Sometimes what students think is most important might not line up with what I as the teacher think is most important, and that's okay. We want to give students that opportunity to bring in their own voice and individuality into the portfolio. Because at the end of the day, the portfolio tells the child's story, not the teacher's story. And so we want to make sure that we're lifting their voice and giving them choice in all that they do. We want to make sure that it's authentic to the subject area or subject areas that we're representing. We also want to make sure that it requires an application of knowledge. We want there to be something behind each one of those pieces that we're including that backs it up, something that they can show that they learned. And then this is probably the most important part. When a student looks at his or her portfolio, he or she should feel pride at the work that he or she is displaying. We want the child to see the growth that they've made and be proud of what they're choosing to share within their portfolio.
So it all comes back, like all things to assessment, it all is about purpose. So when we use portfolios to tell the stories of our students, the learner should know the intended purpose of that portfolio, because they not only communicate complex learning, like Michelle stated, but they also show that what the student has been engaged in, but it also helps us to propel their student achievement, because they're able to really think deeply about what they have done and where they're going next. So that, like Michelle stated earlier, there are different types of portfolios. Some can showcase best work, some are intended to share, and some are more about that assessment and accountability buckets. The growth and project portfolios allow students to share the learning process. Where did they start and how did they progress towards one or more learning goals? The achievement and competence type of portfolio allows students to show what they know and assess their learning. And lastly, that very last bucket, the celebration portfolio allows students to show their best work and what they are most proud of. Each one of these types has its place in class. And with all things assessment, again, it comes back to purpose. What is the purpose of the story that we're going to tell? There's a really nice decision-making process of deciding what can go into a portfolio. And so some of the things to consider are, what kind of portfolio? What is the type? What is the purpose of the story that we're telling? It is essentially the theme that the student is working on. Are we looking to share? Are we looking to showcase? Or are we looking to assess? The second is that we consider our learning targets. So what artifacts are going to go in based on our purpose? Different portfolios require different artifacts to tell their stories. These artifacts are really like those supporting details. How do they connect to the intended learning? Based on the portfolio and the purpose and the learning targets, which pieces of evidence are we going to include? Do we have a set guideline of some things that we have created and shared with students of things that they need to include into their portfolio? How will we ensure that whatever is included in this portfolio is a representative sample? It's enough to say, yeah, we do have sufficient evidence that students have grown or are proficient. That fourth piece is the student annotations, and this piece is often overlooked. Have you ever created a portfolio and the only thing you can say is, well, this is my social studies work, and then you let people flip through it, maybe parents or teachers, and there's really not much substance to why or how those pieces were selected. With student annotations, we ask students to actually write out why each piece of evidence was selected as a supporting detail in their story. This not only helps the portfolio take shape by giving the explanation to the audience, but it also helps the audience to make connections to the work and specifically what to notice about the work, what the student is most proud of. This part is key because it becomes a cueing system for the student as they explain what's in their portfolio. The fifth one is that student reflection piece, and this is one that we'll come back to a little bit in detail. But with self-reflection, this is where students revisit the experience, that learning experience, by looking back over their curated evidence to make statements about what they have learned, how they have learned it, and what worked and what didn't work, and what they might do differently or how far they have come. And this piece is really key because we want students to really begin to think about and build their self-efficacy. And this happens when students have the opportunity to dig deeper into the learning and what that learning meant to them. Number 6 is sharing that portfolio. So with whom and where will that take place? Who's going to listen to that story? And the answer is, who would want to listen to the story? Would it be parents? Might it be teachers? Might it be other peers? There has to be some considerations as to who the audience might be. Will not only help students share their stories, but it also helps them think deeply about that learning journey they took to create that story. And then the last one is organization. Michelle's going to get into this of what that could look like. But this depends, again, on the story that's being told. And there are lots of options, especially now, for how we can share that story in a digital world.
One of the best things to come out of quarantine, I think, is that everyone has become more comfortable with technology. I can't think of a single teacher who's not more confident with his or her tech skills today than they were maybe 6 months ago. We've all been forced into this time when technology really is our primary way to communicate with students. And so we want to lean into not only what we can do with technology, but with what our kids can do with technology. And so we want to encourage them to include various types of files in their portfolio. I think back to when I was teaching and I used to have my students pick their best writing pieces, almost all of which were written or typed on paper and included in a file. No longer is that reality. I can't tell you the last time I actually wrote a piece of paper, a draft on a piece of paper. Instead, I'm using Google Docs constantly. And we want to let our students have that same privilege of using technology and including it in a digital portfolio. So we want to make sure that we're providing them with the opportunity not only to use technology to create their product, but also to share it. So whether that's a video or a picture or a presentation, goodness, it could even be a selfie of the child working on something that they're very proud of. But whatever that is, we want to make sure that we're including a lot of different kinds of files in our portfolio. We also want to make sure that those key artifacts reflect whatever areas we would like it to. So for example, I never like to pigeonhole my students into only sharing their writing because they might not feel as if writing is their strong point. We want to encourage them to include pieces from all subject areas and beyond in order to make sure that every child has something in that portfolio that they feel confident with. So that could be from the arts, could be from physical activities or home nature walks, anything like that that they're proud of, their interests. We want to include them we want to encourage them to include all of those pieces. We also want to focus on the content area, things like writing, but not just their writing, but actually encouraging them to go beyond just including the final product into including a little bit of reflection as to why it was chosen and the process they went through to write. So I encourage students to take selfie videos, and they love to do that, where they're sharing their thinking behind why it was that they chose this. And in this way, it helps make their thinking visible, not just to us, but to anyone viewing that portfolio. Even if the person viewing the portfolio is the child themselves in a few years. We might not remember why we chose to write something or why we chose to include a piece in our portfolio, but if we have that video to remind us, it'll immediately spark our memory. We also want to encourage students to include projects that they've created, even if they're not flat or digital. That's really important because we don't want students just staring at screens all day. We do want them to still physically interact with medium in order to create unique projects. So one way we can do that is to include pictures of those projects, pictures of their final models or creations, something that lets us see and chronicle the learning that has taken place. We also want to give students the opportunity to share their achievements, those pieces that they're proud of. These don't need to just be achievements from school, although they certainly can be. If a child is proud of something he or she has done in an extracurricular sort of way, we want to lift that because all of those pieces help make this child who he or she is. And we want to lift that child up and use this portfolio to tell the story of the whole child. Any evidence of creativity we also want to include. If the child is creating something or making something, we want to include pictures and explanations of those products that they're creating because that again helps us to understand the whole child, gives us glimpses into their creative spirit. Any examples of leadership I like to include as well. This is something that as a teacher you might be able to help with. Sometimes students don't see themselves as leaders, but so many of them are. If you've ever been in a situation where a child has helped you solve a problem with technology, that child is displaying leadership, and we want to acknowledge that and lift that up. That's a great skill for that child to have. Also, if a child has ever reached out to a classmate who might be feeling disconnected and made that phone call or that connection, that's another example of leadership. So really helping students remember what it is that they've done that showed leadership and then putting a spotlight on that. So important that our students see themselves as leaders. And this is my favorite. Just anything that is a little nugget of happiness, something that a child feels proud of or feels as if they would like to share it. Doesn't have to be a major thing. It can be something simple. For example, my son, who's in second grade, recently perfected the recipe for a Chick-fil-A chocolate chip cookie. And he's so proud of that recipe and the fact that he can make it without my help now, that it's just that one nugget of happiness that he has. And he could share that and write about it and explain why that's important to him, even though that might not align to a specific grade level content expectation, it's still important to my child. And so we want to give children that opportunity to lift those little nuggets of happiness into their portfolio. So in summary, what should we include? Pretty much everything. Anything that helps tell the story of that child in a way that we want to share it. These are great resources for students to share their own stories during a student-led conference, or even just a reflection at the end of the school year where they go through and see how much growth they've made. So I would encourage students to include more than they think is necessary, because the more they include, the longer and the more complete that story will be.
So when we work with portfolios and we're working with students to curate a collection of evidence to tell their story, we're really building up student agency and self-efficacy. And learner agency, we talk about it a lot, but it's really a term that captures the important goal of students being active learners and ones that can make choices and take actions to really fully participate in their learning and in the learning community. So learners need opportunities to realize that they can make good things happen when they are in school, whether it be in a face-to-face setting, hybrid, or virtual. Educational researchers have defined learner agency as the ability to exert control and give direction to one's life. And this can be somewhat problematic in the classroom because often teachers are the ones that are controlling the learning and often in full control, right? But with a portfolio, we're really shifting that notion, and we're putting the learning into the hands of our students. We want students to be self-directed, motivated, engaged, and autonomous learners. And this can be fostered through the portfolio process. Sorry, Michelle, I keep going backwards. So we really want to nurture that self-efficacy. And this comes when we build competence through confidence, So why would we want to worry about student self-efficacy? Well, we want to worry about it because this builds those skills that we often talk about as teachers, that self-regulation, performance, interest, participation, persistence, perseverance, diligence, and engagement. And we know that the research on self-efficacy is high. So Hattie, we don't know, if you're not sure about who Hattie is, John Hattie did a meta-analysis and looked deeply across many different research studies and created effect sizes. And the hinge point of his work was at a 0.4. So anything that's 0.4 or above is worth doing in a classroom or could be considered a high leverage practice. And self-efficacy falls in the 0.92. So it is something that we want to nurture in our students because it has great impact on student achievement. And we can do this using self-efficacy scales. And I've put, Rich can put a link to an example of a reading self-efficacy scale. But when we think about those self-efficacy scales, they are really given to students so that teachers can glean some information about from those results. And this reading example can be done with students if you choose to do it, but there are lots of self-efficacy scales that are out there. You can Google them. But the results can really help inform you on how to approach building the self-efficacy of our students. And the results of these scales, as Bandura explains, that once we know what the data is telling us, it can provide teachers with some guidelines to tailor how you approach students to build their individual needs around self-efficacy. So what that means in the classroom is this can help us to isolate those little conditions that can help prevent confidence, and we can work to change them. And that's the important piece. So some of the things that we can do are to help grow our student self-efficacy is really focus on mastery. So when a student completes a task and they've been successful with it, they've had experience with mastery, we can really point that out and highlight that. We can also do this in the form of modeling. So we can see other people complete the task, which can help the student build where they need to go next. So really incorporating that feedback. We can continue to encourage our students. So building in some praise and a little bit of nudging to help them move closer to what they are trying to do. So this is that verbal persuasion or that feedback that will help them get to mastery of that task. Climate, how do we control the stress and anxiety within our classrooms? We know how to do this in a face-to-face setting, but it might look a little bit different. So what can we do to help our students control that stress, to ease that anxiety? And the last one is visualization. So if students can use that internal self-talk, and that often happens when students engage in that self-reflection and goal setting, they can work to envision successful achievement. So really what has the research tells us is that a person's self-efficacy is mutual and cyclical. And teacher self-efficacy is huge. If teachers are not confident about teaching writing or their content area, for example, it impacts the emphasis on that in the classroom. So if I'm not comfortable teaching mathematics, I might not place as much emphasis on mathematics. And we see this happening when other subject areas are often left off because we're so hyper-focused on ELA and mathematics. So we want to make sure that the teacher's competency in teaching specific skills can be increased through professional development in areas of need. But this also gets back to helping our students too. How do we get, because it is a perceived competency, the two are related, and it feeds that collective efficacy, vice versa. So while it might be tempting to skip over the self-reflection piece of the story when we're working with our students to curate their collection, doing so can really create a cliffhanger, right? Leaving out important details for that learner. While it does take some time and it may require some modeling of the teacher, engaging in self-reflection with our students is a regular practice and as part of our learning process can really provide them with valuable internal insights into their own learning. And that's really what we're doing when we're building their self-efficacy and agency. One way to do this could be to provide a scaffold in terms of sentence stems. And that helps students to, as an entry point to the self-reflection process. It gives, and you can give them the examples like, my evidence shows that I'm really good at blank because, and then they would have to explain the rest. Or I am proudest of, or what did I learn and how did I learn it? And the more you use these scaffolded prompts, students will become more comfortable with that self-reflection process. And then you can lead them to more open-ended thinking prompts like, here's my before piece and here's my after piece. Or what did I learn and how did I learn it? And then they will begin to self-regulate that self-reflection internally, which will help them to become more self-directed and motivated learners. So these are two really, really good sentence stems. And this really solidifies that when students ask questions about their work and have time to reflect on their learning process, they're really building those internalized skills that we want them to have in order to be successful in college, career, and being good citizens. So as we think about what we've talked about so far, what might be some types of artifacts that you might have your students collect this year? So go ahead, we're going to invite you to use the chat and to make sure that when you do include everybody, the panelists and all attendees, but what might be some artifacts that you might ask your students to collect this next coming school year?
Rich, would you mind sharing a few that you're seeing in the chat?
Absolutely. So we have photographs of math projects, flip grids, journal entries, drawing pictures, open-ended problem-solving tasks like STEM activities, skits, letter writing, hobbies, writing drafts, games, poems, photographs of hands-on projects, music videos.
It's a great one. I'm struck by the sheer variety of the responses there. Heather, would you say that there's one kind of thing that we should be looking for over and over, or would you suggest just that variety that we're seeing in the chat within the portfolios themselves?
I think it goes back to your purpose. What is the purpose? Are we looking to show proficiency? Are we looking to celebrate learning? Whatever the purpose may be, and it can be all of them, but students have to be aware of what the purpose is so that they can carefully select the artifacts. And I would also suggest that it not happen in, this is a process, right? Not only are we creating that product, but it's a process that occurs throughout the school year. It's not a let's do it at the end of the school year because we have to come up with something and have a student-led conference. You really want to engage our students in this. And it provide them with time to self-reflect, but also remember that student annotation piece. Why was this piece selected? What did I get from this? Why is it in here? We want to have our students ask those deep questions because that's really digging internally into them to see themselves as a learner, how far they've come in their learning journey. But because portfolios, and this is what I love about portfolios, they're student-centered. So we should include other things. We should include those nuggets of happiness. And that chocolate chip cookie brought me joy just hearing that I know that your son knows how to make it. So those are those types of things that we should include in a portfolio because we want to show the whole child. If we think back to that video of that basketball player, that one shot does not define him as a player. There are so many other things that make him the professional athlete that he is, and he has a robust story to tell. So I think whatever we include in the portfolios, we want to make sure that it's a robust story that tells the narrative of the student as a learner, as a person.
Heather, can I give a quick example from a science classroom?
I would love for you to give an example from a science classroom.
So we know in the new science standards that students are expected to use not only their knowledge, but the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts to explain a phenomenon. So I met this one teacher who designed units around anchor phenomenon, and each of the units, they had the class consensus model was sort of added to their wall when they got to a point where they could all explain it. And then she asked her students to go into their science notebooks and show learning. So I put this in the chat. It was I used to think, now I know, and my evidence is. And so she had students pick important ideas that they learned from each phenomenon, and that became part of their portfolio. So not only within that unit, but across the year, they were able to show learning growth. And I thought that was a really neat example of whole class and individual students working together to show that kind of learning.
Thanks, Rich. Love it.
So I think as I'm listening to all these examples, and especially the one that Rich just shared there, I'm thinking over and over about just making it possible for kids to share their stories and whatever they might look like in whatever form they may take. And the one thing that I would say is a great caution for educators, especially now, is when we're relying so heavily on technology, we don't want to just pick something, a tool, that because it's fun or shiny or good for a particular piece. We want to make sure that our tech is directly connected with a purpose. So I'd say that we should never pick a technology without having an explicit purpose, because a lot of times all we need is a picture of that project or a video of that skit that the students put together. So if we can get away with a less technology, that's great. We don't want to make something more cumbersome than it needs to be. And with that in mind, we want to remember that our practices are our beliefs in action. And if we believe that what's really important is the learning, we're not going to put the focus on technology as much as we are on the actual learning, which I think is essential. So what I'm about to show are a few technology pieces that can be used for the purpose of creating a portfolio, but I would never suggest using any one of these unless it fits with your purpose. So in its simplest form, a portfolio is really just a folder where we're going to put stuff that we're proud of. And so Google Drive makes that really easy. In Google Drive, I can simply create a new folder and call it my portfolio, and bada boom, bada bing, I have a place to house my stuff and I have a portfolio. It's very simple, but it works. So if you're just getting started, you're not sure if this is for you, or you're not sure how students might manage this, this might be an easy entry point for students. You can also use Google Sites. I'm a huge fan of Google Sites, and I actually like the new Google Sites better than the old one. So that's sites.google.com/new. And when you go to that site, what you'll notice is that there's a template for student portfolios and portfolios. So right there. So if you're thinking that you might want to experiment with getting started, I encourage you to go here and just look at the templates that are already created. Google does a great job of anticipating teacher needs and tries to address those even before we say them. So I would encourage you to check those out and see if one of those might work for you with a few minor tweaks. If you decide that that's a tool that you would like to use with your students, you can create the template. So you create the Google site, how it might look for a student, and then you can duplicate that site. And you can duplicate it in the same way that you might make a copy of a regular Google Doc. You can duplicate the site so each child has his or her own copy of the site, and then they can edit just their version of the site, which is really nice for those little learners because it still gives them that web design access, but it gives it a little bit more structure. We do. We are lucky enough today to have a few examples from around Wayne County, so I want to lift a couple of those ideas. The first one, and I believe we have Kathy Grinerich Filkins with us today. So if she would like to speak to this, I'd like to give her the floor. Kathy, are you there?
I am here, Michelle. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, great. So hello, I'm Kathy. My partner, Rachel Hoover, and myself, we both are instructional coaches half-time at Shoemate Middle School. And last year, probably around October, we began the process of having all of the students in the school work on digital portfolios using Google Sites. So the purpose, or why, I love that you all brought that up, that you have to have a purpose. It's not just like, why are we doing this portfolio? Our purpose was to prepare for the upcoming school year's parent-teacher conferences. For a while now, our school improvement team has discussed the idea of doing student-led conferences. And so as a way to facilitate that, we thought, well, let's try a digital portfolio. And that would be something fluid that could change over time, and students could showcase their work in that way. So that was our reasoning for that. So I have a few examples to show today of what we did. Now, starting early in this process, we did not use a template for students to use. We are a one-to-one district, and our students are very Google app literate. They all receive instruction from early on, starting in elementary school, but more intensely in 6th grade as to how to create a Google site. So students are pretty comfortable with this. So we thought, well, we'll make a rubric. We will instruct students the basics of how we want their portfolios set up. And then let's just see what their creativity puts forward. And so that's how we began the process. Next slide, please. We are in middle school, and we work on quarters and semesters. So we decided not only to have links, as you can see in this example for Larry Andrews. So there's home, computers, math, science, social studies, ELA, and then we had sub-pages within that for each quarter. So our requirement was that students would submit evidence into that portfolio from each class once per quarter. So they were supposed to pick their best work that they were most proud of to put into this portfolio. We facilitated this during our advisory classes. All students have an advisory class similar to maybe win time or homeroom. And my partner and I took turns visiting each classroom. We showed students how to set up a Google site. We showed the teachers how to set up a Google site, how to add evidence, and we kind of took things from there. So we visited these classes often. We tried to touch base with each classroom once a month. We sort of had a rotating schedule. And what evolved from that is we also developed some student experts that helped us as well. So we would have certain NJHS students come with us to facilitate the process and help others to add to their portfolio. Next slide, please. So in Larry's example here, he has a few pieces of his work from his science class here. So one is something that he wrote about rocks. So it's just called Just Keep Digging. And he just added a link there that people could click on and read about. And then I'm not a science expert, so I'm not sure if that's Breccia rock. I'd have to defer to Rich on that. I know he's the science guru. A little bit about a slideshow there showing his work as well. Next slide, please. We were getting to the point where students were going to publish their work. So when you look through the slideshow, here's a link to Charlotte Glover's published portfolio. She's one of our all-stars, and she also helped facilitate Google Sites. Next slide, please. A few links that I've included for you if you want to take a look. We did an initial professional development session for our teachers where we had myself and the other coach, Rachel Hoover, just kind of went through and taught all of our teachers how to create a basic Google site. We talked about our reasoning for doing so, using the portfolios as kind of a springboard to student-led conferences. We created a digital portfolio checklist for each student to follow, what they had to include, what would be a good choice to put into their Google site for their portfolio. Student reflection piece. So we knew that reflection would be a really important part of this process. So we did create a Google Doc that students needed to think about, respond to once every quarter. Like, take a look at your evidence you've added for the quarter and decide what were you most proud of. And that was great. Our students really, that second quarter, started to get to the fact that, I kind of just put a few links in here. Maybe they're not the greatest examples of my work. You know, next time I'm going to work harder at that. And so it kind of started a process where students were consistently taking pictures of their work when they were proud of, like, hey, can I use my Chromebook to take a picture of this science project so I can use it for my portfolio? Yeah, go for it. So we had to kind of get our students thinking about those things. We had to talk to them about using their Google Drive and keeping it a little bit more organized so that they had those things to pull and to put into their portfolios. We also did progress checks. So once a quarter, my partner Rachel and I, we visited classrooms and we had students bring their Chromebooks to us, and we just looked through them and said, okay, please show me your evidence for what you show, you know, what were you most proud of from the first quarter for your science class. And students would show us, and sometimes they wouldn't have everything finished, and so we would say, okay, you need to go back and add that, and we made it a reward. So for our PBIS program at school, they have school-wide rewards, and we made this one of the requirements. You know, you have your portfolio completed with the checklist provided, you get to attend the reward. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, feel free to email myself or my partner. We're happy to answer any questions you have. We're hoping that we can continue our work this year. We are going to be one of the districts using face-to-face and hybrid, so we're hoping that we can continue this and use this to help us with our virtual parent-teacher conferences that will take place this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. As I was listening to you speak, I was struck by the fact that not only are you teaching the content, whatever it is the children learn in the school day themselves, but they're also learning how to become website designers and organizers of technology and ideas. And that's so important when we think about curating resources. What a great skill for your students.
Thank you. It's been a long process.
Kathy, I was struck by the idea of that progress check because, as we stated before, it's not just that product that we're going to show off at the end. It's a process, and that we have to check in with our students to talk about that process. It's that, you know, ongoing feedback loop, and I love that you and Rachel have included that as part of how you do the portfolios in Gibraltar.
Whenever possible, we love to lift those ideas from real teachers in Wayne County because it's so powerful to hear from those people who are actually doing this good, fine work in their context. And we want to lift up those voices. So we really do appreciate the Gibraltar coaches sharing with us. Likewise, we have an example here from a high school teacher in Canton. Jeff Blakesley shared with us his portfolio that he uses with his students. And I'm sharing it because it's such a creative use of Google Slides. He actually creates templates for the students where they share on a given slide both the standard that they're addressing and then an artifact that shows mastery of that standard or that concept. So it's just a really creative way just to encourage students to link to their other work and to their ideas. So the slide deck becomes that interactive piece that students can use to showcase their learning. When you're thinking about sharing a template, we know that with Google Slides we can share and students can make a copy, but there's something a little extra we can do where we can share it so that we're asking students or giving students the opportunity to make a copy of it in a way where they can see the template before they decide to make a copy. And so that can be done just by editing that URL. So you can see there the example, the URL that's given in the original. And if you take everything from edit on and change it to template/preview, it will create a link that looks a little different. It looks something like this, which hopefully looks familiar because this is a link that I shared earlier today to access our slide deck. It's a way to see that in a different way so that people can click through the slides before they choose to make a copy. And it also prevents the teacher from getting multiple emails saying, can you give me access? Can you give me access? So this is a way to limit the amount of busy work for the teacher. So we know that Mr. Blakesley has done that. He even created a portfolio for his colleagues in literacy, and same concept where they have the opportunity to edit the template, but they have the template there for them if they need it. He has offered himself up as a resource, so if you would like to reach out to him, I believe he's in Traverse City right now enjoying some vacation time, but his email and Twitter handle are going to be put into the chat for you. So if you're a secondary teacher who might be looking for some ideas, he is willing to help you. So when we think about templates, they really provide the bones of what it is that we want the students to accomplish. So you think about it as the teacher is providing the structure, but the students have to add their own personal genius to make that structure come alive. We can tell a student how many slides or what might go into it, but until the child actually puts his or her own fingerprints on it, it doesn't tell that child's story. When you're using Google Slides, you can actually control the structure a little bit more by actually editing the slide template itself. And when you do that, the benefit of doing this is that it allows you to edit the template so that students can't change that because it actually sends it to the background. So Rich is actually putting in the chat right now this very simple example of a snowman organizer. And what you'll notice is if you click on that link, you're able to edit the text on top of the snowman, but not the snowman itself. The structure stays the same. So as a teacher, you could create the background that you would like each of these slides to have, and then the students could fill in the content on top of it. So it's just one of those small tech tips that might actually make the portfolio creation a little easier if you decide to go with Google Slides. To edit the master, you go to View, and then you click Master. And that will open up a screen like you see there on the right where you have that grayish background. And anything that you edit there will actually show up on the back of a slide. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're sharing with students. Little learners especially like to have that structure in place. It makes it a little easier for them if they have the boxes that they need to fill in. So that brings us back to the beginning, really, when we talked about the fact that the portfolio is really that story, the story of the child, and that's the story that we want to tell. So that leaves us with, what stories will your students share? What pieces of information, what nuggets of happiness will they share to tell their story? And how will that story be different this year than in all the other years past? We have a unique opportunity to really capture some history in the making. There's never been a year like 2020, and I think we're all hoping that there's never one again. But this is a chance just to capture those moments, not only so that we remember them, but so that the individual child can remember it. And we're all focused on learning and what it is that the student actually learns this year. We're so interested to see what is it that the child takes away from this year of remote learning or face-to-face learning or hybrid learning, however it turns out. What will we show for that?
Michelle, we have a question from Meyer C about recommended tools for elementary students, and I'm inferring that that means the younger set of students.
Sure, I can try answering that, and then Heather, if you have anything to add, please do. I think that in the simplest form, Google Slides are really easy for littles, and I'm thinking when I think of littles K3, because they provide that container, that slide, you can easily see what's on the slide and what's not, so it's easy for students to manipulate what goes on there. The Google Slides interface really well with things like YouTube and Google Drive. So if students have videos or pictures in their Google Drive, you can pull them in very easily. So that's the easiest one that I can think of to use. You can also use a Google Doc and just use hyperlinks to different artifacts or ideas. So you could just write, Johnny's science presentation, and you could link it right there to the presentation, whether that's a picture of the presentation or an actual Google Slides deck itself. So you can use those two pretty easily. Also, if the teacher sets up the template for Google Sites, with a little bit of help, they can navigate that pretty well too. I can speak from experience. I've worked with first graders using Google Sites, and they can do it. It's a little awkward and cumbersome, but they pick it up pretty easily. So it might even be something that you just let your students explore with.
So my daughter's school uses Seesaw, and it's an application. It's very easy to use. She's been using it since kindergarten, and she'll be a third grader this year. But essentially, it's an app where students would store their, it's really like an application portfolio. So a little bit different than Google Slides. So these can be video recordings. They can actually record in the app themselves. They can take pictures. They can actually create work inside of the app. And what's nice about it is that it curates over time. So if I wanted to go back to her kindergarten school year and look at the pieces that she put in her kindergarten year and compare them to where she is now, I can go back and look at that. I do know that her school district pays for that, but that is an option, and the students learn very quickly. They catch on very quickly. I can also say that even when we went to remote, that's what the teachers were using to not only communicate with us, but also to send us the schoolwork, the learning. And so students were very, she knew exactly what to do, how to get into it, how to navigate it. I had to do very little. So in terms of teaching those littles, Seesaw might be a good option.
All right, we have another question. So how about experience setting a portfolio system in a non-Google learning management system?
That's a great question. So if someone who is not using Google, usually they have access to some sort of word processing and or slide presentation tool. A lot of times that might be Microsoft products. And Microsoft does have lots of opportunities to use similar products as to Google. So using something like PowerPoint for the slide deck, those same features would apply there, especially if you have Office 360, because then you can go online and pretty much everything we said about Google Slides would apply to Microsoft 360. They also have something called OneNote, which can be used in that way as well.
I'm also thinking too, Michelle, even going back a little old school and using thumb drives too. You can even use a thumb drive to store digital pieces on, whether it's a typed Word document or one of those PowerPoints. If you don't have Office 360, even just storing it on a thumb drive might be helpful too.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, I just looked up Schoology also has a portfolio system, and I know a number of our Wayne County districts are moving towards that. So I'm imagining other systems like Schoology or Canvas would also have some similar tools built in, but I'm not as familiar with those yet.
Right, and I think that always comes back to the why too. Like Rich said, if you're using Schoology, if that's something your school is invested in, it is definitely worth your while to look and see what features might be in there, because that might be the perfect tool for you. We don't want to layer on another tool if we don't have to. So we go back to that idea of no tech without a purpose, and really think about what works best for you. Were there any other questions? Okay, with that, then we're going to invite you just to take a moment to give us some feedback. We would love to hear a little bit about maybe what brought you to the session today and how we can improve what we're doing for you. How can we better meet your needs? The whole Wayne RESA crew is here to support you and serve you. So however we can do that, we want to do it. So that feedback button is tinyurl.com/blitzresa. I think Rich put a link directly to the form right into the chat, so you can either follow that tiny URL or just click on the link provided. and just give us a little feedback. We would greatly appreciate it. We also have a QR code if you have a phone nearby, if you want to just snap a picture of that. We'd love your advice on how we can improve and do better. And that leads us to the most important part. We just want to thank you for coming. Thank you for partnering with us in this learning. Thank you for being willing to give up a moment of your summer just to discuss how we might better meet the needs of our students. That says so much about you as an educator, that you're willing to take time out of your busy life just to explore this idea, and we so appreciate you. So thank you for all you're doing for students across our county and across our state.